The first project I'm going to talk about is called Spaces and Places. I did this project with a sculpture class of about 30 to 35 students at the high school level, so students range from 9th grade to 12th grade. This was a ceramics project in which students were using clay, but before they were using clay to create functional objects, and this time they really wanted to create something that was more sculptural. So we were creating these architectural models and focusing in on community and how architecture plays a role in that community by serving the community that it houses. So the first several steps of this project were all just planning. The very first thing that I had students do was to be really aware of the buildings that they passed by and walked by and lived around for about a week. I had them take photos of buildings that they just noticed aesthetically, if they really liked the color of it or the shape of it or the materials that it was made out of, but also buildings that were personally really important to students. So buildings that they spent a lot of time within, buildings that made them feel safe and happy, buildings that they would take like refuge in, whether it be a school or home or a friend's home, the park, or like a community center. So I had students take pictures and choose a few of their favorites, like 5 to 10 of their favorites, print them out and bring them to school. So now they had these physical copies of all of these buildings that they passed by and that they were really passionate about. And I had them turn it around and write about that building. I had them think about the building as something that was architectural, but also something that was meaningful to them. So they were answering questions about the shape of the building, the size and the scale compared to humans, what materials the building was made out of and what colors it was made out of. They were thinking about when the building was built and who it serves. So whether it's serving as like a residential space or a space for entertainment, or if it's serving like a really specific group of people, or if it was like a public space that serves everyone in the community. Other than the way it serves its community, the students were also thinking about how it serves themselves as individuals, how being within the building feels and how long they spend within the building every time they go there. If it's a grocery store, they might be spending just like 30 minutes inside the space, but if it's a home, they might be spending several hours every single day within the space. So after they had written about their locations kind of personally and reflected on them individually, we turned towards the projector and we were looking at an artist named Edie Fake, who's a Chicago-based artist. He is a trans artist in Chicago who recently did this beautiful project called Memory Palaces, where he was taking these old building facades that used to house clubs and organizations and bookstores that were serving the LGBTQ community in Chicago, but have since been torn down or demolished or taken apart. And he was going in digitally and with markers to just like completely decorate the facade so it looked really, really decorative and highly patterned, kind of like a quilt. And so we took everything that Edie Fake was doing with his artwork and tried to channel them into the photos that students brought in. So I put out just like chalk pastel and colored pencil markers and gel pens out at every table, and students were going back into the photos that they took of the architectural spaces around their lives and adding just like heavy color and pattern and line work into it, inspired by Edie Fake, just to spend some time with that architecture and really notice it while working on top of those photos. So after this process, I had students kind of look up from their work and talk to the people at their table about what they'd been working on. So after adding color and pattern and line work into the photos, the students started sharing their stories of each of the photos that they'd brought in with the students around them. So at their tables, they were talking through what each of the buildings that they had photographed means to them personally and how it's benefited their lives in certain ways. And I had passed out scissors for students to start cutting into the photos and cutting out specific parts. So if not the whole building, then maybe they were just focusing in on the window. Maybe that window meant something important to them, or just focusing in on like the signage above the building. And on a big piece of picture paper that was on their table, they started kind of collaging this composite architectural space together and considering the stories behind each student's work, trying to figure out a new story for this joint building that they were collaging together. So all of this was mostly just for students to really recognize that these buildings that they pass by on a daily basis are serving a really specific purpose, and it should be to be serving their community in certain ways. So after this kind of introductory collage activity, we started individually writing the needs of like our specific communities, the communities that we live within. So all of us are a part of our high school community, a part of the Chicago community, but individually we might be parts of like sports communities or specific neighborhoods that students are coming in from. So students started writing out the specific needs of the communities that they're coming in from and how architecture can aid those communities too. Just so you can see what these collages kind of turned out like, I have some examples over here from last year. So students were collaging together and also adding color and pattern, like Edie Fake, the contemporary artist we were looking at. And some of the students were also like kind of writing notes on how their architecture changed as they were like adding on to other students' work too. And they really became artwork in their own right. So although these were students in the sculpture class who were working usually with 3D, they did a really incredible and beautiful job with these like more 2D collage work too. Okay. So after students were looking at and looking towards architecture and buildings in their community that were already existing, I wanted to push students to think about architecture that did not yet exist within the community and how students can kind of build little miniature architectural models to represent what could be added to the community too. So students were creating these blueprints on sheets of graph paper so that they could be thinking about scale and measurement and angles, slowly starting to take something that's 2D into the 3D realm. And it's also a little bit more structured than the collages were, which were more a little bit free form and just fitting pieces together, whereas this one was much more reliant on measurements and angles and really thinking about their architectural design also. So once students felt comfortable with their designs for their new community architectural model, we were starting to move into clay. So I started by doing a ceramics hand building demo. Students had worked with clay prior to this, but again, they were creating something that was functional. So we were learning techniques like the slab building technique and pinch pots to learn how to create like a vessel. But because this was more sculptural, students had a little bit more creative liberty with how they can make these forms. So once students felt confident in their designs for their architectural models, I started doing a ceramics demo to show them how they can start creating something that's more sculptural and less functional. So they can start thinking about like texture and how they can add really, really small details with carving tools or with their hands too. So as you can see in these photos, students are starting to think a lot more about texture, about form, and about how they can really clearly convey that this building is not made out of clay, it's made out of glass or brick or whatever material they were hoping to create their building out of. So during studio time, we were battling a lot of the complexities with clay, especially because students were coming in for just like 45 minutes at a time and having to wrap their pieces up and store them overnight for several days at a time too. The clay was getting like weaker and weaker, so we were running into a lot of structural problems. So I think in the future I would try to modify this project to be depicting maybe like specific pieces of furniture or maybe just like the facade of their architectural model rather than the whole three-dimensional model itself. After the students' architectural models were fired and glazed and fired again, students had time for a little bit of self-reflection, which involved photographing their artwork in our documentation room with like a nice plain backdrop and nice lighting, as well as writing out an artist statement kind of in the form of like an architectural proposal, so as if they were sitting in front of a city committee and actually planning to implement their ideas into the community. So students were thinking about how their model could aid the people in the community in ways that the community is not being reached currently, and how it is specific to the community that they're talking about too. I noticed that one of the main issues that many students were creating work surrounding was creating some kind of safe haven for youth. So many students were talking about how in their neighborhoods and from the high school that I'm working in, because it is selective enrollment, we have students who come from all over the city of Chicago from varying zip codes and neighborhoods. But something that was shared by many of them was this concern that students didn't have a place to go to after school where they felt like safe and that they could just hang out and do anything other than just going directly home. So many of these architectural models are just like safe spaces for young people in the city to sit and do homework and feel safe and loved and just to hang out necessarily outside of school. Something else that a lot of students noticed was that in terms of architecture around their community, a lot of people weren't seeing a lot of nature. So I was also pushing students to, rather than creating a building, to just think of this project as creating spaces. So some students were creating gardens or parks or ideas for different plants that could be implemented into the streets or into corners of their community and streets too. The next project that I'm going to be talking about was a comics project that I did with a few drawing and painting classes with students from 7th grade up to 12th grade.